Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is the next big game from FromSoftware. I didn't expect much from this game at all, really, to be honest. Like, I saw it advertised, I saw gameplay of it from a while ago, and honestly, I wasn't really too bothered about it at all. And it's obviously going to be very difficult for a game to follow in the footsteps of something like Bloodborne, Dark Souls 1 to 3 and Demon Souls, because they're very beloved games by many people. Sekiro had a little bit of a twist on the original Soulsborne gameplay, and this was opting for a more arcade style of play, pitting players with nothing but their skills at parrying, dodging and jumping to avoid enemy attacks. The game features no armor, no additional weapons, no shields like the Dark Souls series does, and I think this is a very good thing because it forces players onto their back foot. It forces players to use their instincts opposed to just, leveling up, getting gear and weapons and just using that to get through the game instead, because in previous Souls games you could become very overpowered very early by just grinding souls and upgrading yourself through various stat upgrades, and in this game you can't do that. You have to rely solely on your ability to play the game, which I think is actually a lot better and it makes it a lot more challenging. Sekiro is full of beautiful areas which are full of treasure, enemies and some of the most difficult bosses that I've played in any game. I wouldn't say that Sekiro is more difficult than Dark Souls, because Dark Souls 3 was like my first Souls game. I think, as they say, your first Souls game is always the most difficult one that you're going to play. But it definitely is more rewarding than Dark Souls, because in Dark Souls there's a lot of things that help you along the way, like gear and weapons, whereas in Sekiro it's kind of all about your skills. Anyway, today we're going to be summing up my experience of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, and obviously this is my experience because, in terms of these types of games, it is very subjective in terms of the experience you have with the games. Things that I found difficult, people might have done straight away and stuff like that. But anyway, today we're going to be reviewing Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Like many of FromSoftware's most popular titles, the gameplay of Sekiro consists mainly of combat. However, there is also an emphasis on exploration, platforming, and stealth, as well as 17 bosses for you to take on. The combat in Sekiro is uniquely rewarding compared to other Souls games, rewarding focus on guarding and parrying opposed to dodging like in Dark Souls. This is a nice change. The combat rewards players for trading blows with your opponent and being aggressive as well as defensive. FromSoft proved with this game that it is possible to renew the gameplay format of the Soulsborne series and turn it into something almost completely new. I really like the combat system in Sekiro. The combat rewards patience and learning enemy attack patterns, not just with bosses but with all types of enemies. I noticed that as you're going throughout the different areas in Sekiro, you can learn the different attack patterns of these enemies, and that makes you just all the more efficient at getting through that stage. The game forces you to get out of that mindset of dodging away from attacks and instead forces you to fight enemies in which parrying is the only option, because obviously the combat in Sekiro is much more based around parrying and trading blows and clutching swords opposed to dodging away from enemies and smacking them from behind. The combat in Sekiro rewards strategy and skill and determination, not button mashing and exploiting easily avoidable attacks. Sekiro's enemies have incredibly strong tracking, which Dark Souls enemies lacked, so if you do try and dodge away from some attacks, you're just gonna get caught in their tracking, so you might as well just start parrying while you're ahead. This means you can't abuse the dodge mechanic, you have to fight enemies head on. There's also a severe lack of significant invincibility frames during dodging, so this just means that you're gonna get caught in attacks even while dodging as well, so you might as well start parrying. As well as being oriented mostly around combat, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice also focuses on stealth and exploration. Now, the exploration parts are kind of self-explanatory. If you play any of the Dark Souls games, then it works pretty much the same. You walk around an area, search for items, you go around corners, find secret hidden passageways, and obviously the areas that you can explore are full of secrets. They're full of world-building items, they're full of consumables that can help you on your journey, they're full of NPCs. There's loads of things you can find if you actually go out of your way to look for them in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, much much like its predecessors, and honestly it's a nice addition to the game to be wandering around an area and find like a hidden side quest which has a long quest line that you can then fulfill and get a reward at the end of it. It's quite nice, and that's something that Dark Souls did very well. The side quests and side activities, in a way, they weren't forced to the player. You know, they were something that you could seek out on your own and you could do it in your own time, which I really do appreciate and really like. I did a few of the side quests in this game and they were a nice break from the main quest line. And obviously the focus on stealth in this game as well, it's a new feature. You can drop down and do takedowns on people, you can do stealth finishes, you can, you know, sneak around people. It's actually done really well. It's a very simple stealth system, there's nothing really much to it, it's just crouching, you can hide in tall grass, you can hide behind corners, but it adds that little bit more of diversity to the gameplay that the other previous games from FromSoftware lacked, and I really do appreciate this addition, especially considering you're playing as a shinobi. You're obviously going to use stealth at some point, and you know, it's just a very interesting feature. I probably should have used stealth maybe a little bit more instead of running in there, but it is very useful nonetheless when I did use it. The playable areas in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice are absolutely beautiful as well. You can explore castles, huge temples, caves, and beautiful natural areas, all with the inspiration of 15th century Japan. So I mean, it's really nice. It's obviously not all based on complete fact, because it is also a fantasy game, but it has that flair of feudal Japan in there, and you know, that's something I've always appreciated. I've always thought that Japan is a beautiful area, and I'm sure most of you agree with me, so it's just bound to be a beautiful game. As well as fighting enemies, it's a good idea to explore different pathways to find consumables and quest items, as well as having 7 experience points to make yourself more powerful. Exploration will help you further in your quest in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, because it encourages the player to fully explore all of the different areas and all the different pathways you can go through before moving on to the next part of the main quest. I know I certainly did. I didn't want to walk through an area without actually exploring the other pathways first, because I could miss, you know, useful items that had helped me throughout the game. Sekiro stays true overall to many gameplay conventions of the Soulsborne series, and obviously I appreciate that because I immensely enjoy those games. However, it changes just enough to make it feel like its own thing. And this shows just how masterful FromSoftware are at game design. They literally, you know, took the formula of one of their most popular franchises, added so much on top of it that it just feels like its own thing, and that's something that I really appreciate about Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. It wasn't the same old, it couldn't be like going back and playing Dark Souls 2 and being like, I've kind of experienced this before. And Bloodborne, it was even very similar to Dark Souls as well in terms of tone and the themes that were throughout the game, whereas Sekiro is something completely fresh and completely different, and it really was a nice, refreshing experience. It was challenging, but it was different to Dark Souls, and that's what counts. The boss battles of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice deserve their own segment in my opinion. These were some of the best boss battles I've played in any video game ever. They were really well designed, and that's honestly to be expected in a FromSoft game. As I said earlier, there's 17 main bosses you can fight throughout the main game, and these do not include the mini bosses that you find throughout the different areas of the world. And they do challenge your skills in this game. They force you to adapt to the new gameplay mechanics of Sekiro, and they have incredibly unforgiving attacks sometimes. Some of the most memorable bosses that I fought in this game were, you know, Lady Butterfly, Guardian Ape, True Corrupted Monk, Demon of Hatred, Great Shinobi Owl, and finally, Ishin Sword Saint. Lady Butterfly was the first boss in this game that kicked the shit out of me because I wasn't yet used to the parrying mechanic in the game. I thought it was kind of a last resort. I thought you still had to dodge away from attacks to try and get away from them. Yeah, Lady Butterfly gave me a really fucking hard time. I managed to defeat her without actually using much parrying because, I mean, she had incredibly high posture and her posture meter refilled very quickly. So I just thought that dodging and then attacking was a good idea at this boss battle, and it definitely wasn't. However, there was a cheese that I found out unintentionally. It's if you dodge to the side of her and then attack, you're going to keep stun locking her over and over again until she's got no health anymore. So I kind of unintentionally found a cheese, because I went on to tutorials on the boss and they said that that was a cheese that you could do, and I was like, fuck, I've already did that. It wasn't until the next boss that I defeated, Gyubo Oniwa, that I started to catch on to the fact that you have to parry. You can't use these old tactics in the Dark Souls games. You can't just dodge and, you know, smack from behind and eventually get all their health away. You have to whittle down their posture bar, you have to parry, you have to keep up clashing swords with them, or else you're not going to be able to do efficient amounts of damage. Honestly, the boss that I had the most difficulty on this whole game was the Guardian Ape. In hindsight, it wasn't actually that difficult. It had very, very telegraphed attacks. It did a lot of damage, and there weren't many attacks that you could actually parry. You had to dodge in this boss battle, or at least that's what I thought anyway. In hindsight, the boss battle wasn't actually that difficult. It was just the boss's erratic movesets and the fact that it was very, very hard hitting, and there were some attacks that I found very difficult to dodge at all. The boss left really, really small room for error, especially considering that after an incredibly tough first phase, there was a second phase that took me completely off guard. Like this, it pissed me off so much because like I'd fought so hard to defeat this first phase of the boss. It took me, you know, hours and hours, only for there to be a really, really difficult second phase as well that was almost completely different to the erratic nature of the first phase. Later on in the game, you can fight an optional boss in which the main boss is the Undying Ape from the second phase of the first Guardian Ape fight, and then when you get to the second phase of that, a Guardian Ape drops down from the ceiling and you have to fight both phases at once. And honestly, given my experience in the first Guardian Ape boss fight during the main story, I was able to do this first try, which is fucking hilarious because it took me hours and hours and hours to finish the first Guardian Ape fight, and the second one, which is supposedly more difficult, I was able to do pretty much straight away. Now, two fights that are notable for their impeccable design and less their complexity is Isshin's Sword Saint as well as the Great Shinobi Owl. Their attacks are fast, relentless, and their special abilities are very punishing if you aren't fast enough to deal with them. The Great Shinobi Owl is much easier in comparison to Isshin, and his attacks are more telegraphed, and his special abilities can be dealt with much easier than Isshin's. However, that doesn't change the fact that it's a very great boss battle. I mean, the Great Shinobi Owl is a shinobi, and they showed that through the way he fights. You know, he definitely does practice the way of the shinobi, and he's obviously a master shinobi because, you know, he uses firecrackers, he uses smoke bombs, and he uses many abilities that you can utilize as yourself as a shinobi in the game, which is quite interesting, and it just shows the amount of detail that FromSoft put into designing their bosses. Honestly, with Isshin's Sword Saint being the final boss, it was probably the most difficult boss in the game, but I ended up just caving and cheesing it instead. Now, I would love to go back. I would love to go back and do that boss legit, but honestly, I was too tired by that point. I just wanted to fucking kill the boss, so I just cheesed it around him until he did a lunge attack, attacked him from behind, and that was pretty much how I ended him. It wasn't very honourable, but it got the fucking job done, and shinobis aren't honourable anyway, so I don't fucking care. Lastly, two bosses that I think were just a general great test of endurance were the Demon of Hatred from near the end of the game and the True Corrupted Monk at Fountainhead Palace. They both have 3 health bars, which in terms of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, that is a fucking lot of health bars. You know, that means that the boss fight is going to be very long, and it's going to be very difficult to balance out all of your different consumables to make them last as you take more damage from the boss. To be honest, these bosses, even though they have 3 health bars, they have a multitude of hard hitting but easy to deal with attacks, especially True Corrupted Monk. I had a lot of difficulty with that boss, don't get me wrong, especially Demon of Hatred as well. I had a lot of difficulty with both of these bosses, but the attacks in hindsight weren't actually that difficult to deal with. It was just a matter of fact of me being sloppy and not doing the right thing at the right time. There is much less room for error in these boss battles because they have so much health and because their attacks are so hard hitting that if you do have a wrong step, you're going to lose a fuck ton of your health. These bosses really do put your skills to the test, not in the same way as the Great Shinobi Owl or Sword Saint Isshin. They're more a test of how much you can parry and how much you can deal with in a very short space of time. The Demon of Hatred and True Corrupted Monk are very long drawn out boss battles that force the player to be very frugal with their consumables and making sure that you can in fact get through this boss, because you're bound to take damage on these boss battles. There's just attacks that are bound to take you off guard, you know, as a normal player, so you've got to be very careful. You've got to be very careful during these boss battles, and if you get hit, that can be game over all in one. Sekiro contains some of FromSoftware's best boss battles. It seems that with each game they release, they get better and better at more boss design, adding more and more for the player to focus on. However, the bosses will always feel incredibly rewarding when you beat them. That's something that FromSoft do fucking amazingly. When you finish a boss that you've been trying so hard to defeat for ages, when you finally beat it, it's like the best fucking feeling in the world, and that's something FromSoft always highlight in their games, and that's why the bosses in FromSoft games will always be some of the best. There are many different ways of upgrading yourself in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, and the first major upgrade that you get is the Shinobi prosthetic. Now this is a huge gameplay feature. It allows the player to unleash deadly attacks with various loaded weapons at the cost of things called spirit emblems, which are a currency in the game that you get from killing enemies or buying them from idols. Shinobi prosthetic tools can be found throughout the world and fitted to the prosthetic arm to be used as weapons. Firecrackers are good against beasts, the Sabemaru is good against enemies from Fountainhead Palace, and the Flame Vent is strong against red eye enemies such as the Chained Ogre and Ashina Elite. The Shinobi prosthetic also allows you to grapple to various different areas, which is probably the most useful gameplay feature. Say if there's enemies chasing you and you don't want to fight them all, you can just grapple on top of a roof and there's no fucking way of them getting up there. So I mean, it's definitely probably your most useful tool is the ability to grapple about. It's possible to upgrade your vitality by using prayer beads, which can be bought from many different vendors and also mainly acquired from mini bosses throughout the open world. And it's possible to upgrade your attack power by killing significant bosses throughout the game and then reliving the memory of that boss battle at an idol. In Dark Souls, you were able to get a head start and increase health and damage by spending souls on vitality upgrades and by using weapon upgrades to increase more damage. And this could be done from a very early stage. In Dark Souls 3, if you got enough Titanite shards and enough souls, you could upgrade your weapon to like +7 really early on, and it wasn't even that difficult to do. Whereas in Sekiro, it makes players rely on their skill. You can't just farm XP and Sen and become overpowered by upgrading yourself. You have to play through the game and rely solely on your skills during these boss battles. And I've noticed a lot of the ways that Sekiro is designed forces players into relying only on their skills in combat, opposed to other things like upgrades, like weapons. You know, because there is no weapons in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. There's no extra weapons, there's no extra armor. It's just you fighting the enemies on your own. The only help you get is like Shinobi prosthetic upgrades or vitality upgrades or attack power upgrades. And these are very few and far between, and especially considering the Shinobi prosthetic, the upgrades are very expensive, and if you don't want to put the time into it, then you're not going to get better Shinobi prosthetic upgrades. I'd say the main things that help during the course of your time playing Sekiro Shadows Die Twice are the consumables. Stuff like gourd seeds, it increases the amount of times you can use the healing gourd, which is incredibly useful. I mean, it just means you can heal more times, which gives you more errors that you can make during fights. Divine Confetti can be used for killing spectral enemies like the Headless, like the Shichiman Warrior mini-bosses, which are pretty good bosses. They're pretty good bosses, and if you have Divine Confetti, it makes them so much easier. Oil to set enemies on fire, ceramic shards for stealth sections, or snap seeds for illusions. So the consumables are incredibly useful. You don't get a lot of them. You only get a lot of them if you go out of your way to kill certain enemies, or if you go out of your way to find them in the open world. But the consumables are an incredibly important part of the game, and they make it just that little bit easier. Two of the items that I found were incredibly useful throughout the course of the game was the Ceremonial Tanto and the Mortal Blade. Now the Mortal Blade is tied to the story. You get it as a result of a main quest. However, it's able to deal very powerful attacks against certain bosses. It's an incredibly useful weapon, and you get it pretty much for free by playing the main story, and it doesn't cost any spirit emblems to use or anything like that. You can just unleash attacks from the Mortal Blade, and it is incredibly powerful, although some enemies they're not really susceptible to it as much as others. The Ceremonial Tanto is very useful when farming Sen and XP because it gives you 5 free spirit emblems at the cost of half of your overall HP. And if you have lots of healing gourds, it's honestly not that bad. It's not a bad trade-off. 5 free spirit emblems during one run of farming, it's not that bad at all. It just means you don't waste spirit emblems on farming, because you want to save spirit emblems for when you actually need them. So being able to pop the Ceremonial Tanto, giving you enough spirit emblems to, you know, maybe use a few of your Shinobi prosthetic abilities while you're farming, it makes farming a whole lot easier. Lastly, skill trees allow you to unleash special new attacks, more efficient healing gourds, and holding more spirit emblems, stuff along the lines of that. It was a nice change from just upgrading stats in the Dark Souls games, because obviously you have a certain amount of stats that you can put souls into in the Dark Souls games, and there were no specific skills. There were weapon arts, but they were, put on swords and weapons instead of actually being used in the skill tree, because there was no skill tree, whereas they've actually added a skill tree in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, and the upgrading and progression is actually done very nice. It doesn't allow players to rely on grinding and farming to become overpowered at an early stage, but it does mean that if you get a little bit more XP and you have some excess XP, you can spend it on certain different skills that will help you that bit more throughout the game, which is nice. I think as a whole, in terms of the grand scheme of things, upgrading and progression in Sekiro is handled very well. It doesn't allow players to get overpowered from an early stage. It means that you're just going to improve as the game goes on. It's sort of scaled in a way. I mean, your vitality will increase the more prayer beads you get, and as you get further into the game, you'll bump into more mini bosses, and the same with attack power. There's 17 main bosses throughout the game, and there's different ways of getting attack power from those bosses, and your attack power is going to increase as your time in the game increases. So it's kind of balanced out, it's proportional. If you're early in the game, you're going to have low attack power, low vitality, and not many consumables, but if you're further into the game, all of that is going to be a lot more plentiful because you've put more time into it, and I think that's a really good way of doing progression in games. Many people have said that Sekiro is harder than the Soulsborne games that have come before it, and honestly, I didn't have nearly as hard a time playing Sekiro as I did playing Dark Souls 3. However, they say that your first Souls game will always be the hardest one you play because you've got to get used to the sort of conventions that are used in these games. The bosses in Sekiro are much more forgiving and don't have attacks that stun lock you into taking ridiculous amounts of damage. Whereas in Dark Souls, a lot of bosses are gonna hit you so fucking hard and they're not gonna relent until you're dead. Whereas most enemies in Sekiro kind of hang back a little bit, give you a chance to heal, give you a chance to get your breath back, give you a chance to get your posture back up. Whereas Dark Souls bosses, they're just going to go at you until you're dead, pretty much. And the reason for this is because most bosses in Sekiro are designed to be straight up parried, and you're meant to trade blows with them, whereas in Dark Souls you had to dodge around them, and a lot of enemies would have an incredibly wide radius of attack, which would make it way more difficult to actually dodge successfully. Plus, most bosses in Sekiro are just guys with swords, and that means it's so much more easy to read what they're going to do, opposed to this huge beast like in Dark Souls. You're not going to know what the fuck it's going to do, whereas you know how swords work and you know when they're going to attack and what they're going to do. Whereas say other enemies in Dark Souls that are like a beast type enemies, they're going to fucking just smash around really until you're dead on the ground, and there's no way of you really knowing what the fuck they're going to do until you die a few times. And this is why I had more trouble on the beast type bosses in Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, such as the Guardian Ape and the Demon of Hatred. These were enemies that I couldn't predict what they were going to do because they weren't using swords, pretty much. I mean, obviously the second phase of the Guardian Ape is using a sword, but I was talking about the first phase of the Guardian Ape and the whole of the Demon of Hatred boss battles. They're beast type enemies, so I didn't really know what the fuck they were going to do. I had to die a few times to see what their attack patterns were, whereas with the human type enemies that use swords, it's much easier to know what they're going to do because you know what swords are. And Sekiro isn't more difficult than Dark Souls in terms of general gameplay, not even boss battles, because you have way more gameplay styles to use to your advantage. The main one being stealth to clear out a whole area. You can't do that in Dark Souls. You can't use stealth to clear out a whole area of enemies in Dark Souls. And you can also use prosthetic tools like firecrackers to manage situations if they're getting a little bit out of hand. You can also grapple to high places to completely escape enemies and completely get out of their radius, so you can go back and then stealth take down the rest of the enemies that are left. In Dark Souls, you can't use any form of stealth, and there's no way to escape enemies apart from running back where you came or running straight past them. And plus, the Dark Souls combat is much slower and requires a different kind of patience, which is waiting for the right time to attack, say if your enemy is staggered or they're just finishing an attack animation. Whereas the patience required in Sekiro is determination to build up an enemy's posture so you can perform a finisher on them. Sekiro is not more difficult than Dark Souls. Each game has different things that are harder than the other. However, personally, I had a much bigger challenge playing Dark Souls 3 and Dark Souls 1 than I did playing Sekiro. In comparison to Dark Souls, Sekiro is, in my opinion, a walk in the park. However, that's not to say that the game is easy, because it certainly isn't. Sekiro kicked my ass so many times, I just wouldn't say it's as difficult as Dark Souls. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is a fine addition to FromSoftware's library of challenging titles. It builds off the familiar structure of games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne and Demon Souls, but it adds its own shinobi flair to it, which is really refreshing and really nice. In my opinion, the combat is designed to perfection in this game, and every combat situation is an absolute pleasure to play, even if you die countless times playing it. This game definitely exceeded my expectations. I didn't expect much of it at all because I saw that it was a lot different from Dark Souls and didn't know whether or not I'd like it, but FromSoftware exceeded my expectations completely. And Sekiro Shadows Die Twice has taken its rightful place among some of the best experiences I've ever had in gaming.